What if the next big invention isn't a triumph of human progress, but a disaster that no one saw coming? History is filled with discoveries that began as ideas of hope, curiosity, or even medicine, only to spiral into weapons of chaos and tools of death. When we think of inventions, we imagine light bulbs, printing presses, and vaccines, things that changed the world for the better. But hiding in that same history are inventions that ruined lives, toppled cities, and altered the way humans wage war. Some of them were created by accident, never meant to do harm, and yet their very existence opened the door to centuries of destruction. One of the most terrifying examples of this came from a laboratory in Italy in the mid-19th century, when a chemist named Ascanio Sobrero stumbled across a substance that he himself begged the world never to use. That substance was nitroglycerin. Sobrero wasn't searching for ways to destroy. He was a man of science, curious and methodical, trying to find new medicines. In 1847, while working with a mixture of glycerin and nitric acid, he discovered a liquid with unusual and violent properties. Just a drop, if handled wrong, could explode with devastating force. Unlike gunpowder, which had been around for centuries, nitroglycerin was far more powerful and unpredictable. Sobrero was horrified by what he had unleashed. He tested it, saw the destruction it caused, and admitted it was too dangerous for use. In fact, he later said he regretted the discovery and wished he had never found it. But history has a cruel way of ignoring the warnings of those who see the danger first. The story of nitroglycerin didn't end with Sobrero's caution. Years later, another figure would take this unstable, deadly liquid and transform it into something the world could use. That man was Alfred Nobel. Today, Nobel is remembered as the founder of the Nobel Prize, a set of awards honoring achievements in peace, literature, and science. But long before he became a symbol of peace, Nobel was a man who profited from war. He saw nitroglycerin not as a mistake to bury, but as a tool to harness. By mixing the liquid with a soft, absorbent material, he created something more stable, something that could be shaped, transported, and detonated when needed. He called it dynamite. At first, dynamite was hailed as a miracle for builders, miners, and engineers. Imagine trying to dig a tunnel through a mountain in the 1800s with nothing but shovels, pickaxes, and black powder. Progress was slow, dangerous, and costly. Dynamite changed that overnight. With a few sticks of Nobel's invention, rock could be blasted apart in seconds. Railroads, bridges, and mines expanded at a speed never seen before. Entire cities grew, industries thrived, and the modern world began to take shape. People praised Nobel as a genius, a man who had given the world a tool for progress. But progress has a dark side, and dynamite soon found another purpose: warfare. Once generals and soldiers realized how much more powerful dynamite was compared to traditional explosives, the battlefield changed forever. No longer were battles fought only with muskets, swords, and cannons. Now armies had access to explosives that could level fortifications, obliterate enemy camps, and sow terror with a single blast. Nobel had created dynamite with construction in mind, but it was war that gave his invention its most infamous reputation. This is where the story becomes chilling. Imagine you're a soldier in the late 19th century. You've grown up learning that war means lines of men marching with rifles and cavalry charging across open fields. But suddenly you face explosions that rip through the air, tearing apart entire groups of men in seconds. Dynamite made the battlefield more deadly, and wars more destructive. Cities weren't just besieged, they were blown apart. Civilian lives were caught in the blasts just as often as military targets. What Sobrero feared had come true. A tool too dangerous to exist had not only been made stable, it had been unleashed on the world. The irony in all this is that Alfred Nobel himself became deeply conflicted about his role in spreading destruction. When his brother died, a French newspaper mistakenly printed an obituary for Alfred instead. The headline read, "The Merchant of Death is Dead," calling him a man who made his fortune by finding ways to kill more people faster than ever before. Nobel was shaken. He had wanted to be remembered as a great inventor, not a monster. Some say it was this moment that inspired him to leave his vast fortune to establish the Nobel Prizes, as if trying to wash away the blood on his hands. But no matter how noble his later actions, the truth remains. His invention of dynamite was one of the great turning points in the history of destruction. Sobrero had warned against it, begged people not to use nitroglycerin, but once the idea existed, it could not be undone. The genie was out of the bottle. Humanity had crossed a line. And this is where we see how the story of nitroglycerin and dynamite fits into a larger truth about history. Often, it's not the evil men plotting destruction in dark rooms who changed the course of the world. It's the scientists, the thinkers, the inventors, people who never intended to cause harm. A chemist mixing chemicals in his lab, a visionary trying to build better bridges. They set out to solve one problem and accidentally open the door to something far worse. Cabrera wanted medicine, Nobel wanted progress. What they gave us was the blueprint for modern explosives, a step that led directly to the bombs, shells, and missiles that define warfare today. If you pause to think about it, this story raises a disturbing question. How many of the things we use today, things we think of as safe and useful, might one day unleash disasters we can't yet imagine? Electricity gave us light, but also gave us the electric chair. Chemistry gave us fertilizers, but also chemical weapons. The line between invention and destruction is always thinner than we want to believe. Nitroglycerin was just one example, but it reminds us that history is littered with dangerous discoveries disguised as progress. It forces us to look at the past with a critical eye, and ask not just what inventions did for us, but what they cost. Cabrera saw the danger and wanted to bury it. Nobel saw the profit and unleashed it. And the world has been dealing with the consequences ever since. If you're fascinated by these stories of brilliant people making discoveries that turned into disasters, then you're in the right place. This is only the first part of a journey into the most catastrophic inventions in history. Stick around for the next stories that will shock you just as much. And before we go further, make sure you hit that like button, drop a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to Dumb Historians so you don't miss the next chapter of this series. History might seem like it belongs in the past, but as we'll see, its accidents and mistakes are still shaping our world today. You think you know innovation? Think again. The story of human progress is full of dazzling discoveries that pushed us forward, but hidden in that same story are inventions that seemed perfect at the time yet ended up being disasters of unimaginable scale. Some of the worst mistakes in history weren't made out of malice or greed, but by accident solutions that solved one problem only to create another far worse. Few examples capture this truth better than the creation of chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs, the so-called miracle chemicals, of the 20th century that turned out to be one of the greatest environmental nightmares the planet has ever faced. The man at the center of this story was Thomas Midgley Jr., a chemist whose name most people don't know, but whose work has touched the lives of nearly every human being on Earth. In the 1920s, refrigeration was both a luxury and a hazard. The chemicals used to keep food cold, substances like ammonia, sulfur dioxide, and methyl chloride, were highly toxic. Leaks were common, and those leaks often killed people. Imagine living in a city apartment, proud of owning a refrigerator, only to have it leak a cloud of poisonous gas while you slept. The problem was so bad that many households still relied on ice boxes, cutting massive blocks of ice to keep perishables cool. Industry leaders wanted a safe, non-toxic, non-flammable refrigerant that could replace these killers. Enter Midgley in 1928. While working for General Motors, he and his team developed a new chemical compound by combining chlorine, fluorine, and carbon. The result was chlorofluorocarbons, odorless, colorless, stable, and seemingly harmless. At first glance, it was the perfect invention. No more poison in the kitchen, no more flammable gases threatening to blow up your home. CFCs were easy to make, cheap to produce, and adaptable to countless uses, and the world embraced them. CFCs quickly became the backbone of modern refrigeration. They were pumped into refrigerators, freezers, and air conditioners. Aerosol sprays used them as propellants. Even inhalers and cleaning products carried them. If you were alive in the mid-20th century, you were surrounded by CFCs. Even if you didn't know it, they were marketed as the chemicals that made modern life safe and comfortable, a miracle of science. By the 1950s, they were everywhere. By the 1960s, production was in the millions of tons annually. But behind that sense of safety and progress, a slow-motion catastrophe was building in the sky above. CFCs were stable, so stable, in fact, that they didn't break down in the lower atmosphere. Instead, they floated upward, lingering in the air for decades, until they eventually drifted into the stratosphere. And it was there, high above the Earth, that their true danger revealed itself. The stratosphere contains the ozone layer, a fragile band of gas that shields the planet from the sun's ultraviolet radiation. Without it, life as we know it would be impossible. Crops would wither, animals would sicken, and humans would suffer skin cancers, cataracts, and DNA damage at rates that would cripple entire populations. The ozone layer is the planet's invisible shield, and no one in Midgley's time even suspected that his invention would attack it. When CFCs finally reached the stratosphere, ultraviolet radiation broke them apart, releasing chlorine atoms. A single chlorine atom could destroy thousands of ozone molecules in a self-perpetuating chain reaction. It was like unleashing an assassin into the Earth's atmosphere, silent and invisible, slowly cutting holes into the very shield that protected life. For decades, no one noticed. The chemicals were too convenient, too profitable, and too deeply embedded in daily life for anyone to question. It wasn't until the 1970s that scientists began to piece together the devastating truth. Two researchers, Mario Molina and Sherwood Rowland, published a groundbreaking study in 1974 warning that CFCs could destroy the ozone layer. At first, their claims were met with skepticism, even ridicule. Industry leaders dismissed the warnings, insisting the chemicals were safe. But as the years passed, the evidence became undeniable. By the 1980s, satellites revealed a massive hole in the ozone layer above Antarctica, a gaping wound in the planet's protective shield. For ordinary people, this revelation was terrifying. Suddenly, the world learned that everyday items, your refrigerator, your deodorant, your air conditioner, were not just conveniences, but weapons quietly aimed at the planet itself. The more CFCs we used, the more damage we caused. Entire generations realized they had grown up surrounded by chemicals that were slowly dismantling the atmosphere. And the consequences weren't abstract. In places where the ozone thinned, people experienced higher rates of skin cancer. Farmers worried about crops wilting under harsher sunlight. Marine ecosystems, particularly plankton at the base of the food chain, suffered under increased UV exposure. The very stability that made CFC so attractive turned them into one of humanity's most dangerous pollutants. The irony here is staggering. Midgley had set out to solve a deadly problem, poisonous refrigerants, that killed people in their own homes, and, in doing so, he created a new problem on a global scale. He didn't intend to harm anyone. He probably thought he was making life safer and better. Yet his miracle became a nightmare that almost dismantled the very system keeping the planet alive. Midgley's story doesn't end with CFC. He also played a role in another infamous invention, adding lead to gasoline. Another solution that poisoned entire populations and left a toxic legacy still with us today. Some historians have gone so far as to call Thomas Midgley the man who had more impact on the Earth's atmosphere than any other single organism in history. It's a title no inventor would want. What makes this story so haunting is that it was the work of an evil genius trying to destroy the world. It was an intelligent man solving a problem that seemed urgent and real. And isn't that the thread running through so many of history's worst blunders? The road to catastrophe is often paved with good intentions. Midgley didn't unleash CFCs thinking they'd shred the ozone. He just wanted people to have safe refrigerators. But the scale of the damage shows how easily an invention meant for good can spiral into disaster. By the time governments acted in the 1980s, banning CFCs through the Montreal Protocol, the damage was already severe. The ozone layer was bleeding, and though efforts to restore it have shown progress, it will take generations for the scars to fully heal. Humanity got lucky, we caught the problem in time to act. But the story of CFCs remains a reminder of just how fragile our world is, and how even the smallest mistake in a laboratory can ripple outward into a crisis for the entire planet. The tale of Thomas Midgley and his miracle chemicals, ISNT, just history at SA warning. It forces us to look at the tools we use today, the conveniences we take for granted, and ask what hidden costs might be lurking behind them. Because as the story of CFCs proves, sometimes the deadliest disasters are the ones born out of the best intentions. Ever wonder if that everyday item you use could have a secret dark past? It's not always about grand schemes or deliberate malice. Sometimes, the greatest disasters come from the simplest mistakes. That is the story of fire, of invention, and of how a small spark in 17th century London turned into one of the most destructive events in the city's history. The Great Fire of London was not just an accident, it was a catastrophe waiting to happen, fueled by human invention, poor planning, and a dangerous mix of convenience and carelessness. In the 1600s, fire was the center of daily life. It cooked food, heated homes, and gave light after the sun went down. But creating that fire was not as simple as striking a match the way we do today. Before the invention of matches, starting a flame required skill and patience. People relied on flint and steel, rubbing sparks into tinder and carefully nurturing them into flames. It was a process that could be frustrating, especially in damp weather or when fuel was scarce. Then came the development of early matches. By the mid-17th century, inventors were experimenting with chemicals to create a tool that could make fire instantly. White phosphorus, discovered around this time, became the key ingredient. It was volatile, unstable, and highly flammable, but it offered something revolutionary: a small stick that could burst into flame with the lightest friction. For a world still bound to candles and hearths, this seemed like progress. But progress often hides its dangers in plain sight. Matches with white phosphorus were unpredictable. They could ignite in pockets, boxes, or even in the air if the temperature was right. Yet people embraced them because they made fire convenient. Fire, however, is not a convenience to be taken lightly. In a city like London in the 1660s, fire was both a necessity and a looming threat. London was a city of wood. Narrow streets wound through neighborhoods of timber-framed houses, their overhanging upper floors almost touching across the lanes. Roofs were thatched, chimneys were crude, and fire breaks were non-existent. Add to this the fact that the summer of 1666 had been long, hot, and dry, and the entire city had become a tinderbox. One mistake was all it would take. That mistake came in the early hours of September 2nd, 1666. Inside the house of Thomas Rona, a baker on Pudding Lane, the baker's oven had not been properly extinguished, and the embers ignited nearby materials. Normally, such a fire might have been contained, but the house was wooden, the wind was strong, and the flames spread with terrifying speed. Within hours, the fire leaped from one house to the next, devouring everything in its path. The ease of fire-making, thanks to matches and stored combustibles, played its part in this chain of disaster. In a city where flames were never far away, candles in every room, ovens burning day and night, hearths smoldering constantly, the invention that made fire simple also made carelessness deadly. Fire no longer required patience or skill. It was easy to create and, as London discovered, impossible to control once unleashed in the wrong conditions. The fire raged for 4 days. It consumed 13,000 houses, 87 churches, and countless businesses. Landmarks vanished in smoke and ash. St. Paul's Cathedral, a towering symbol of the city, collapsed into ruins. Tens of thousands of people fled, carrying what little they could save, while others watched everything they owned burn before their eyes. The air was thick with smoke and ash, and the roar of flames filled the city day and night. The human toll was staggering. Though official records claimed relatively few deaths, modern historians believe the true number was far higher, as the poor and unrecorded vanished in the inferno. Survivors described scenes of chaos, families torn apart, desperate crowds clogging the streets, and rivers choked with boats carrying refugees. It was a disaster not just of fire but of human fragility, amplified by the very tools meant to make life easier. The invention of matches was not the cause of the Great Fire, but it symbolized a larger problem: humanity's drive to make life simpler while ignoring the hidden dangers. Londoners had embraced matches and fire-making tools because they wanted control over fire at their fingertips. Yet that control was an illusion. One overlooked ember, one careless act, one unstable chemical, and the city's entire wooden skeleton became fuel for a catastrophe. Think about the ordinary items in a 17th century home: wooden beams, straw mattresses, wax candles, fabrics, tar for ceiling roofs, pitch for ships, and barrels of oil and spirits. Every household was a stockpile of fuel, waiting for a spark. The baker's oven was just the match that lit the fuse. The destruction also exposed how unprepared the city was. Firefighting in 1666 was primitive at best. Buckets of water, leather fire squirts, and hand-pumped engines could not stop the inferno. Firehooks were used to pull down houses to create fire breaks, but hesitation and confusion delayed decisive action. By the time officials ordered buildings demolished to slow the flames, it was too late. The fire had already leaped past the barriers. The irony is striking. The same human ingenuity that invented matches to make fire accessible had failed to invent the systems needed to control it. Progress had given people a tool of convenience, but no safeguard against its consequences. Matches made fire personal and portable, but in a city designed without thought to fire safety, that convenience was lethal. For Londoners, the Great Fire was more than a physical disaster. It was a psychological blow. The city that had survived plague, war, and political upheaval was humbled by its own vulnerability. People realized that what they thought of as progress, the ability to strike fire instantly, was also part of their undoing. The fire turned homes, businesses, and even memories into ash. Generations of work vanished overnight. The rebuilding that followed reshaped London, replacing wooden structures with stone and brick, widening streets, and enforcing stricter building codes. But those changes were paid for in suffering and loss. They were the scars of a city burned by its own reliance on fragile invention. The story of the Great Fire of London is not just about one careless baker or one unlucky spark. It is about how human innovation, even with the best intentions, can make the world more dangerous when combined with short-sightedness. Matches, white phosphorus, ovens, candles, all were tools of survival that became weapons in disguise. When people lit matches in 1666, they saw progress, instant fire at their command. What they could not see was the hidden price. Every invention, no matter how small, carries a shadow, and in London's case, that shadow stretched across the entire city, turning convenience into catastrophe and progress into ashes. What happens when the search for beauty turns into the creation of horror? That question haunted the world during World War I. At the heart of it was not a weapon forged in secret military labs, but an accidental discovery that began in the peaceful world of chemistry. German scientists, looking for new dyes to color fabrics, stumbled across compounds that had devastating effects on human skin and lungs. What started as science for art and fashion soon became one of the most feared weapons of modern warfare. Mustard gas. The First World War was already a nightmare before chemical weapons entered the scene. Trenches stretched for miles, mud sucked at soldiers' boots, and artillery fire turned battlefields into wastelands. Life at the front meant living with rats, lice, and the constant threat of sudden death. But when poison gas arrived, it introduced a terror that felt almost supernatural. The enemy no longer needed to fire bullets to kill you. The air itself became a weapon. Mustard gas did not explode in a fiery blast or pierce through armor with a single shot. Instead, it clung to the environment. Released from shells, it spread as a yellowish-brown vapor, heavier than air, rolling silently across trenches and fields. Soldiers often didn't realize what they were breathing until it was too late. Hours later, blisters would swell across their skin, their eyes would burn until blindness set in, and their lungs would fill with fluid, leaving them choking for air. Death could take days, and survival often meant a lifetime of scars, both physical and psychological. The cruel irony was that this discovery was not intended to be a weapon at all. In the early 20th century, Germany was a leader in the chemical industry. Its scientists were experimenting with compounds that could bind to fabrics and create long-lasting, vivid colors. Dyes were big business, transforming fashion, art, and even military uniforms. During this experimentation, researchers noticed that some of these compounds caused intense irritation when they came into contact with skin. What might have been discarded as a failed experiment in another era suddenly found new purpose in a world consumed by war. The German military recognized the potential immediately. World War I had bogged down into a stalemate, with neither side able to push the other out of the trenches. Traditional weapons were failing to deliver victory. A weapon that could bypass defenses, sow panic, and cause mass suffering without the need for direct fire seemed like the solution. And so, what had once been meant for dyes became a chemical weapon. The first major use of poison gas in the war had been chlorine at Ypres in 1915, which suffocated soldiers in a green cloud. But mustard gas, introduced later, proved far more terrifying. Unlike chlorine, which killed quickly, mustard gas lingered. It sank into soil, clung to uniforms, and made entire sections of battlefield unusable for days. Soldiers dreaded not just the immediate effects, but the lasting contamination. A simple brush against a contaminated surface could leave a soldier disfigured for life. Imagine the horror of standing in a trench, already exhausted and filthy. When a shell lands nearby and releases a mist you can't escape, you might not even know you've been poisoned until hours later. When your skin begins to bubble and your lungs seize with every breath, medical staff were overwhelmed. There was little they could do beyond trying to ease the pain, but the blisters were resistant to treatment, and the damage to lungs was often irreversible. For the men in the trenches, gas changed the way war was fought. Gas masks became as essential as rifles. Soldiers had to carry them everywhere, and false alarms caused entire battalions to don masks for hours, suffocating in their own sweat and heat. But masks could fail, and the gas could find cracks. The battlefield became a place where the very air could betray you. Mustard gas was particularly cruel because it did not respect the boundaries of war. It did not discriminate between soldier and civilian. When winds shifted, the gas could drift into villages, poisoning farmers, children, and animals alike. Entire landscapes were scarred by its use. It created not just physical devastation but a legacy of fear that lingered long after the clouds had blown away. What makes this story even more tragic is the sheer accident of it all. A compound born from the pursuit of color ended up stripping away life instead. It was not an invention of military minds seeking destruction, but of chemists seeking creation, and yet, under the weight of global conflict, even the most harmless discoveries could be twisted into tools of suffering. The men who returned from the war bore the evidence on their bodies. Survivors of mustard gas attacks lived with chronic breathing problems, scarred skin, and blindness. They became walking reminders of how science and war had collided in the most grotesque way. Many could no longer work or live normal lives, left to survive in societies that were unprepared to care for them. The mental scars were just as deep. Soldiers described dreams filled with choking gas, the cries of comrades, and the endless sight of blistered flesh. The use of mustard gas also changed the rules of war itself. It sparked international outrage, leading to treaties banning chemical weapons. Yet the knowledge remained, and so did the temptation to use such weapons again in later conflicts. A discovery that was meant to brighten fabrics had, in effect, darkened human history. The story of mustard gas is a stark reminder of how easily human invention can slip from creation into destruction. One compound, one experiment, one small accident in a laboratory can spiral into a nightmare that haunts generations. What begins as a search for beauty can end in unimaginable pain. And in the trenches of World War I, soldiers learned that progress often carries a hidden cost, a cost they paid with their bodies and their lives. Cinema was supposed to be magic, a brand new way for humanity to capture stories and dreams and share them with the world. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, motion pictures were exploding in popularity. Audiences crowded into theaters to watch flickering black and white images dance on a screen, marveling at how technology had finally captured life in motion. It felt revolutionary, a doorway into the future. But beneath the glamour and excitement of this new medium was a hidden danger that would turn dreams into nightmares. The very material that made these films possible, cellulose nitrate, was a death trap waiting to ignite. Cellulose nitrate film was chosen because it was flexible, durable for its time, and could hold images clearly. For inventors like Thomas Edison and the brothers, it was the perfect material to bring motion pictures to life. What they didn't realize, or at least didn't fully respect, was how unstable it was. This wasn't just a fire hazard, it was practically an invitation to disaster. The substance burned at an alarming speed, and didn't even require oxygen from the air to keep burning. Once a reel of nitrate film caught fire, there was no putting it out. Water, sand, or blankets were useless. It would burn until it consumed itself, producing toxic fumes that choked anyone nearby. Imagine sitting in a packed cinema in the early 1900s. The room is dark, the only light coming from the projector as it clicks and whirs, throwing moving pictures across the screen. Suddenly, there's a loud pop from the booth. Within seconds, flames shoot out as the reel ignites. The fire spreads faster than people can react. Panicked audiences rush for the exits, but theaters were often poorly designed for escape, with narrow doors and stairways that became choke points. Entire crowds were trapped in a matter of moments. Some theaters became tombs, filled with smoke, fire, and desperate cries. What was meant to be an evening of joy turned into catastrophe. One of the deadliest examples happened in 1929 in Dromcolaga, Ireland. A nitrate film being shown in a parish hall caught fire, and the flames engulfed the building almost instantly. 48 people, many of them children, lost their lives. Tragedies like this were not rare. Across the world, cinema fires claimed lives and destroyed entire archives of early film history. Countless movies from the silent era are gone forever, not just because they were poorly preserved, but because they quite literally went up in flames. The destruction wasn't limited to theaters. Film storage vaults were just as dangerous. Studios and archives, often unaware of how unstable nitrate was, kept reels stacked in hot, poorly ventilated rooms. All it took was a spark, a bit of friction, or even the heat of summer to set off a chain reaction. In 1937, the Fox Film Vault in New Jersey caught fire, erasing thousands of reels, including many silent films that no longer exist in any form. In 1965, another fire destroyed parts of the MGM archive. These weren't just accidents, they were cultural extinctions. Entire works of art, whole careers, and pieces of history were lost forever because the very foundation of cinema was built on such a volatile substance. Nitrate was so unstable that archivists and projectionists told chilling stories about reels igniting without warning. There are accounts of cans of film exploding simply because they had aged poorly and decomposed into unstable chemicals. Archivists working with old nitrate reels often wore protective gear and handled the material like they were dealing with live explosives. In a sense, they were. What makes this story particularly tragic is that the choice of nitrate was, at the time, seen as perfectly reasonable. It was readily available, it produced sharp images, and it allowed the birth of an entire industry. Without it, cinema as we know it might not have taken off in the way it did. But that practicality came with a price that few foresaw. The same properties that made nitrate flexible and useful also made it one of the most flammable materials ever used in a mainstream product. The fallout of this mistake stretched beyond the physical dangers. The artistic cost was staggering. Film is not just entertainment, it's history, culture, and memory preserved in motion. The nitrate fires didn't just kill people, they killed pieces of human creativity that can never be recreated. We'll never see certain silent masterpieces, never know the full careers of some early actors, never experience the experiments of directors who were shaping what film could be. It's as if an entire library of human thought and expression was erased in flames, leaving only fragments behind. For the people living at the time, the risks became a grim reality. Projectionists were some of the most vulnerable, locked away in tiny hot booths with reels of nitrate worry past heated bulbs. They were constantly at risk of being burned alive if something went wrong. Stories spread of projectionists keeping buckets of sand or special fireproof blankets at hand, though they were often useless once a reel caught. Insurance companies began refusing to cover certain theaters unless they took extreme safety measures, but even with precautions, nitrate fires continued. The situation grew so dire that by the mid-20th century, safer alternatives like acetate film known as safety film were finally introduced. But by then, the damage had been done. Decades of history had already been reduced to ash, and families had already lost loved ones in cinema fires. For archivists and historians today, nitrate remains a double-edged sword. It preserved the earliest images of human motion in stunning clarity, but it also destroyed so much along the way. This story is a haunting example of how innovation can go wrong not through malice, but through oversight. A simple choice of material, made without full understanding of its consequences, turned a dream into a nightmare. The movies, meant to bring joy and wonder, were also bringing flames and death. The cost was measured not only in lives lost, but in the disappearance of cultural treasures we can never recover. What began as humanity's attempt to bottle up time in moving pictures instead revealed the fragility of both art and life. It showed that even the most magical inventions can have dark shadows, and that progress often leaves behind victims hidden in its glow. The silver screen may have dazzled audiences, but behind it lay the smoke and ashes of a dangerous secret reminder that even the brightest dreams can burn.